So welcome to our fireside chat, Building and Backing a Better World. We're recording this in October at Flywheel headquarters. We're taking the necessary precautions for COVID-19, wearing masks and social distancing. However, we'll be removing our masks so that the audience can understand us. I'm very pleased to be joined by two experts in building and backing. Dr. Shante Williams, the CEO of Black Pearl Ventures. She's an expert in healthcare, entrepreneurship, venture capital, and much more. And also Jesse Fripp, who's a global finance expert, an expert in strategic governance, in greenfield ventures, and the former GM of the Aga Khan Agency for Microfinance. Thank you so much for joining us today. So our systems are broken. According to the latest Gallup polling, only 13% of Americans are satisfied with the way things are going. And the data coming from our communities mirrors this trend. Suicides have gone up steadily, 33% since 1999, and it's at the highest rate since World War II. Drug overdoses have increased by 6x since 1999 and have become the leading cause of injury-related death. And pregnancy-related mortality has steadily gone up since 1987, with the disparities affecting Black women 4 times higher than other women. In wealth, we've seen that the richest 1% have gotten richer. Over COVID-19, $637 billion have flowed to billionaires, while many of us are searching for work or looking for homes or worse. Finally, in justice, we know that the US has 5% of the world's population, but about 25% of the world's prisoners. And again, the injustice disproportionately affects Black men. But if you juxtapose these dire numbers with 2 other numbers, we'll find an interesting story. We are incredibly generous. We give $400 billion as United States citizens to non-for-profit and philanthropic organizations. That's more than $1 billion per day. On the other side, we're genius. We invest $130 billion into startups every year. So our philanthropic backer landscape is rich. Our venture capital backer landscape is rich. So the first question that I'd like to pose to our panelists is, given the richness of our philanthropic networks and the richness of our venture capital networks, why are we trending in the wrong way? Why are we having problems solving these major issues, these issues that are actually critical metrics to any industrialized nation? And we'll start with Dr. Shante.
Well, thank you for having me, Kasem, Jesse. That's a really complex question. I think one of the things we have to keep in mind is, especially in America, we're a capitalist society, and we tend to send the money to the things that will make us money. And problems tend to need to be solvable and measurable. And when we talk about these very large scale, very complex issues that don't have a direct singular cause and effect, then the story just becomes much more muddy. And, from a money perspective, we funnel money into things that we know we can solve because we're winners, right? You said we're genius. And so at the end of the day, we want to be able to say, hey, my money went to this thing, and in 1 quarter or, half a year or in 1 calendar year, everything's better. And everything that we're experiencing is just, it's not that direct cause and effect singular one-off.
Mm-hmm. I think that makes a lot of sense. I mean, most of my career has been in developing markets, but I think much of that experience you can see as you described the sort of impact of short-term thinking focused on immediate gain, often at the expense of long-term success and outcomes that we actually are looking for. So I think it does require, capitalism is a very strong engine, but like any engine, it has to be calibrated and directed in constructive ways. I think there are good examples of how to change, the outlook from short-termism to long-termism, but it takes intentionality, it takes time, it takes partnership, and a willingness to kind of rethink the way we've done things to date. which can often be very scary and disruptive.
Yeah.
So I want to circle back around on venture capital, and I want to talk about venture capital and then philanthropy, if we could. So, what I'm hearing is that, in venture capital, there are economic pressures, economic realities that maybe force us to focus on, sort of quarter-to-quarter progress, or maybe even, yearly progress, which are, too short of a cycle to really see changes to complex systems. So the backers are backing those things that can get them the returns that the economic pressures their LPs need them to get. And then the builders are kind of following that path and building the things that the backers will back. So that becomes a constant feedback loop. Is that correct? Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah. I would definitely say the beauty of venture capital is that I don't use my own money to invest, but then that means that even as a backer, I have a boss. And that boss expects me to have specific outcomes and to hit metrics because I gave them this beautiful plan of how I'm going to make them more money. And that's a great thing, but at the end of the day, that means that the box that I get to operate in isn't as wide, I think, as a lot of people think, even if you have a very, very large fund. So if you've got a $2 billion fund, there are reasons or, very specific rules that you're supposed to follow in order to give a very specific outcome. And those outcomes are constantly measured. We put out a month-over-month report, we do a quarter-over-quarter report, and my bosses, the people who back the backers, are asking, have we, are we on track? Am I going to make my money back? Are we seeing the returns? And frankly, venture capital is such a risky, risk-laden field that out of the 10 bets that I make, I'm really only betting that one of them is going to be amazing, and to be a complete home run and everybody's going to know about it. So, I think, there's some fundamental misunderstandings about the current state of venture capital, especially how it works. But then it also leads me to think we can change that because someone wrote those rules, and we have an opportunity to really rewrite those rules.
We talk about this quite a bit, Shante, you and I. I want to sort of get your feel on something you've talked to me about before, about the difference between answers and solutions. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so that very complex ball of problems that the world is experiencing, not just the U.S., the entire world, where we have high maternal mortality rates. We've got healthcare disparities across the board. We have poverty. We have environmental pressures and injustice, and we have people experiencing all of these things. And it's not as simple as if you live here, then this is what you experience. Every problem is diced up in cross sections. So what I might experience as a Black woman, Jesse might not experience. And one of the things that I've found is when we're really good at identifying the list of problems, right? We have a long list of problems and everybody knows what they are. But then the quarter-to-quarter cycle puts us in this cycle of answers, because an answer is directly addressed to the one problem, and it's usually bidirectional. Every now and then, there's kind of two factors we put in, but it's based on things we can measure. Solutions are complex, and solutions actually may be very individualized. So what one demographic needs, another demographic may require something completely different, and a solution has to have multiple levers in order to be effective for a wider swath of people.
Yeah. Jesse, you've worked with many foundations, you've worked in developing countries, you've seen novel and creative ideas to finance and lift, finance ideas and lift people out of poverty.
A few failures.
Yeah, some successes and failures. So on that side, when we're thinking about developing countries and creative ways, microfinance, using foundations, philanthropy, same question. We've been working on a lot of these problems outside of our borders for quite some time. Why are we having trouble from the foundation or philanthropic perspective solving some of these issues?
No, I think it's a great question, Kasem. I think one part of the answer is that in sort of the international development world, an ecosystem of investors, implementers, partners has developed that I think has its challenges, but it also brings a greater capability in some instances to deploy the right mix of capital and the right mix of sort of investor expectations. I think, to your point, Dr. Shante, I think that's a critical factor. So, if we, look at, organizations like the U.S. SIF, the Sustainable Investment Foundation, which is really tracking sort of ESG metrics, you see, a greater move towards public equity capital being available. The Global Impact Investing Network is more focused on, so that's more do no harm. Global Impact Investing Network is measuring sort of do intentional good. And again, that's focused on institutional investors. Now we have this emerging structuring tool called blended finance that we see quite a lot in emerging markets. And I would say, even in my experience in the U.S., which was historically more focused on the community development financial institutions in the early stages, like Shore Bank Corporation of Chicago and others, that blending of financial expectations, investor expectations, foundations coming in to take greater risk, ideally, because they're equipped to do that. They're not, their expressed objective is to catalyze new ideas that inherently have a much higher level of risk, and they don't expect necessarily to get their capital back. In fact, quite often they expect not to get their capital back. I mean, it's a grant. That can then be leveraged to ideally bring in other layers of investment. So you look at it sort of like a layer cake, where you have each layer of investment supporting the other, and aligning to the expectations of those investors. So I can talk in a moment about some examples where that has been quite transformative in emerging markets in ways, like in Kenya in digital finance, that have actually moved the needle on poverty alleviation in very material ways, like lifting whole segments of population out of poverty, because it creates a systemic change effect, which I feel like we're not yet, despite all the capabilities and capacities that you mentioned that we have here in the U.S., which are extraordinary and unparalleled. I think we're in a place where we need to re-engineer and re-gear those capabilities toward those solutions and those real outcomes that Dr. Shante mentioned.
Yeah, and you raise a really interesting point. I can't wait to talk about this in a few minutes, that we tend to think of developing worlds as needing these types of solutions, but not necessarily our own backyards. And we're here in Winston-Salem, where there are major social determinants of health that we're ranking near the bottom, things like food security, housing security. And so I'm really excited to talk about maybe some things you've seen in the field that might work here. But before we go there, in private equity and thinking about venture capital, we hear a lot about impact investing. In fact, this and subsequent events that we're holding are going to be focused on impact. But that tends to be squishy as far as like what that means. And I know it's important to you for everything that you invest to have an impact. So what does impact mean for you as an investor? And what do you think we need to do to kind of maybe codify what that means and create a shared understanding of what we need to measure? Sort of same question I asked to Jesse, like what do you see, what's the good and what's the bad in this move towards impact investing?
Well, so I love the idea that it's not one or the other. So when people say impact, or I'm an impact investor, I'm a social impact fund, I don't consider myself a social impact fund at Black Pearl. However, I am keenly aware that if I am investing in transformative projects that are in the health space that will really make a dent in some of the issues that people are experiencing, that will have a tangible impact on the population or the community in which we deploy those companies. I personally don't believe that it's one or the other. So what I come into projects, or when I come into a company, or when I'm presenting to investors, even in some of my community service work, is I'm telling folks, you can have a tangible impact, meaning you can see less food insecurity. You can build a grocery store that employs people in the neighborhood, that pays them, a living wage, and have a business that is giving a profit at the end of the day and is self-sustaining. One of the things that I think we as citizens or philanthropists or investors, I love the idea of an activist investor, right? Mm-hmm. So you're coming in and you're saying, no. At the end of the day, in the public system and even in venture capital, everybody has a boss, right? So if I am the person with the money, then I can come in and say, hey, I only invest in grocery stores that pay people to be able to live in the area they work in. And I think for me, it's not social impact or return, it's social impact and return. And my job now as an investor, and I think I'll call it my life's work if I can be grandiose, is to make sure I'm striking that balance. And so I am intentionally never putting the financial return at the expense of the actual people impact or the environmental impact. And I think the environmental part is where, we tend to get a little squishy until it's at our doorstep. But keeping all three in balance, I know there was a movement, I guess 5 or 6 or 7 years ago, the triple bottom line, and really talking about people, profits, and place, and making sure that all of these things stay in balance. And I think it sounds very catchy, but none of us exist in a vacuum. The air on the bad side of town will filter to the good side of town, because that's how air works, right? And, we talk about crime, poverty, and those kinds of statistics in one area. But I'm pretty sure criminals don't just go to the poor area to steal from poor people. That doesn't make any sense, which means their problem is your problem. And creating this idea of an actual cycle where it doesn't matter who experiences the problem, but we can all benefit from the solution is really how I have started to look at my dollars, whether I'm giving them philanthropically, whether I'm investing my personal funds, or if I'm investing on behalf of a fund. And I think keeping all of those in balance and not pitting one against the other is where I am. But then one final point is asking ourselves, someone once asked me, how much money is enough? How much return is enough? I think that's highly dependent, right? Yeah. Do I want 4 billion % return? Of course. Is it necessary? No. 4% return is 4% return. And I think even in our heads, when we think about what is, financial return or financial gain and what's beneficial, we have to right size it. Would I rather live in a world where everybody's a millionaire if that meant no billionaires? Yes, I think that's equitable, And it's like, but you're still a millionaire. And it's like, yeah, well, how much is enough? How do we right size what an acceptable level of return is? Because we have already lived with the reality of what acceptable outcomes are. And that means that people are losing. And we have to figure out maybe bringing down the returns, not saying, you make no return, but at the same time, the balance has to be, there and struck up in some way.
And I'll just add that, there's been studies that show investments into the social determinants of health. Every dollar put in returns, $1.75, $2 back. Yeah. Investments into diverse founders. Yeah. Like this isn't charity, right? But investment into diverse founders, they have 3x exits to all white founders. So there is a financial story to be told there. They will get the returns. Yep. It's about de-risking the whole scenario. So finally, let's move into some solutions. I'll start with you, Jesse. $400 billion in the United States is given every year to philanthropic organizations. I think the ones we know about are Gates Foundation, Rockefeller Foundation. If we look at the biggest checks that Gates Foundation and Rockefeller Foundation are writing, it's to governments of foreign nations, it's to giant international banks, and to NGOs and other nonprofits. They also give smaller amounts of money to other places. But we've already discussed that it's not necessarily working in the timetable that we might feel comfortable with, and sometimes it's not working at all. So on the flip side of that, based on your experience, what are some of the models that you've seen in your work, either in the United States or in developing countries, that maybe we can start to bring home and create strategies around?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and I think we are on the cusp, because a lot of, as you described, Dr. Shante and Kasem earlier, I mean, a lot of these conversations are happening. A lot of investors, want to achieve this sort of complementary set of outcomes, financial returns, and positive outcomes for the communities that their investments are supporting. I think the blended finance is one of the most interesting and effective tools that I have seen deployed, and it really relies and plays into that philanthropic thread that you mentioned, whether it's foundations, like the big foundations that you mentioned, or family foundations, high net worth individuals. I mean, I think there's an opportunity there to do a lot, and it doesn't actually take a lot. I mean, I think that, if we think about one of the most transformative blended capital failures in the emerging markets, it was the one that created M-Pesa in Kenya, which is credited with sort of kicking off the global digital finance revolution, which now has expanded access to finance to hundreds and hundreds of millions of people who were excluded before. And I say failure because it was originally a small grant from the government of the United Kingdom to experiment with how microfinance borrowers, very small, like $100 borrowers in a conventional bricks and mortar model, could more readily repay their loans through this network of agents that a cellular network provider had rolled out. And it didn't really work, but it did spark the thinking around, well, why are we just limiting our approach to this? And it followed on some additional grants to say, well, can we actually just sort of cut out that middle area and go directly to offering financial services on the mobile network. Mobile wallets actually providing that solution linked to regulated financial institutions, and that then drew in the private player, Vodafone in this case, a big multinational cellular company, and the rest is history. I mean, that deployment now serves 20 million people in Kenya. It's sparked replication in many countries. It's in some ways maybe not single-handedly, but certainly catalyzed the digitization of that economy. And a lot of other services are now piggybacking on that piece of infrastructure. Right? So it was that initial grant, which was a pure grant, which was given, let's try something out. If it works, great. If it doesn't work, we learn something. And that's exactly what happened. And it was transformative. And if you have more of that happening, I think, at every level in the U.S., in conjunction with private players, you can see those transformations.
Yeah. I'm sorry, Kasem. I was just saying, I love the fact that a failure is a success, right?
Absolutely.
Because, I mean, that's defining what outcome we want, right? Like, I gave money to investigate, coming out of the clinic where research for the sake of research yields things that can be amazing. That doesn't mean the experiments I did are going to get me the Nobel Prize, but they could be definitely setting up the next set of people to come in and, maybe fail again, but we learned something at every juncture. And that's what we teach our entrepreneurs. I hope that's what we're teaching our high growth ventures. But, I think even getting that concept into the minds of governments and into the philanthropic system is so important. There is no such thing as just throwing money out there. I mean, we should learn something no matter what the outcomes were. If we miss every single outcome, why did we miss them? That's the part that's important, not that we check the boxes.
Jesse, something you talk about a lot is the demonstration effect. Can you talk a little bit about what that means and how you've seen that be transformative?
Yeah, I mean, it's so fundamental to I think, how change happens, because I think in emerging markets, in what I call developing markets in the U.S., it's very difficult, and I don't think it's necessarily it's usually not the right thing to do to come in, to have someone coming in from the outside and say, I've got the solution for you. You should do this because I'm smart and rich and whatever. It's about you're building a partnership to say, okay, we have some capabilities, you have some capabilities. Let's try something out and see if it works. But let's do it at a scale that does not put the community, the entrepreneurs, the people you're working with at risk, right? Because especially in environments where people are struggling with poverty, with inequity, with crisis, conflict. I mean, I've spent a lot of my career in conflict-affected countries. Talk about do no harm. I mean, that's really essential. So demonstration is about saying, let's try something together and see if it works at a small scale, and see if it has a tangible, beneficial outcome to you, the end customer, user. Does it make your life better, not a year from now or 2 years from now, but does it make your life better today? And if it does, great, let's start to build from that. And let's have the tools and resources behind us to be able to build from that. But if it doesn't, then we minimize, the impact is minimal. The risk that we're asking, our partners, our customers, our communities to take is minimal. The capital provider in that case takes the risk. The grant, provider takes that risk. And I think you then also build, a buy-in, trust. Trust is really essential, I think, with your customers, and especially with new technologies and new business models. And that's the most powerful thing. I mean, again, the M-Pesa example is a good example. That was largely driven once there was the ability to deploy a mobile wallet where people could, move money, send money to a remote village without having to take all the risks of giving cash, to a bus driver, or going themselves during a period of unrest in Kenya during that period. Once that happened, it didn't take much. People, individual consumers, drove the uptake. They said, "This is valuable. This helps me. This helps my mother, my son, my daughter," and that drove it. But the demonstration was there. It was a pragmatic, real, tangible outcome for the end user, and I think that's essential. And that's what those grant approaches can help to deploy.
I've seen that take place in healthcare, where your expertise lies. You can speak a little bit about what we've done in healthcare around oncology and experimentation for aggressive cancers. But there are several things that come to mind. HIV/AIDS, breast cancer, for example, where we've seen this collaboration from marketing, private dollars, public funding, move the needle on some of these major, health issues that we've seen. And right now we're in the middle of a pandemic, where I think we could use some creative solutions around marketing and making sure people understand the risks that are involved, for themselves and others. Can you talk a little bit about some of the successes that you've seen from the healthcare side, and then if you'd like to talk about, some creative things that you've seen in venture as well, that'd be great.
Yeah. So. You mentioned AIDS, you mentioned breast cancer. Both are public health things that we've all, in the 80s, we saw mysteriously people starting to die. With breast cancer, you got here because you were birthed by a mother, unless you're an android. And so, women have breasts, and that's, so if you're watching your mother die, or your aunts or your grandmother. And so both of those health conditions came from the concern came from the people who were experiencing them. And on both sides, one, we'll take AIDS first and say, it started with a community that was stigmatized, and healthcare experts coming in and saying, no, this may be where it's exhibiting, it may be most prevalent, and we're seeing a cluster, but let's do the basic research. We got to raise money. We had people who took their private dollars and put them into the bucket and said, okay, let's keep researching. Let's figure out how we start creating medications that people can benefit from. We saw, AIDS walks. You saw pharmaceutical companies come along and say, okay, we're putting our research dollars in. And so that confluence meant that now AIDS is not, now we know that AIDS is kind of a secondary step and HIV is first. So if we can keep people in the virus stages before they get to AIDS, it's no longer a death sentence, and people have these tangible outcomes in long life, and the complications don't catch up to people for a long time as long as they're compliant. And then taking the next step further in that, they also, we now see a lot more, we see advocacy on testing, we see advocacy on making sure people can afford the good drugs, making sure that we're keeping the prices down on those drugs so that globally people can afford, switching over to breast cancer, exactly the same type of groundswell. I was reading an article that the actual Go Pink, this is October, so the Go Pink for breast cancer movement started somewhere around 1984. And I don't think, any of us would, I was around in 1984, but I was 2. It wasn't what it is today, right? So now we see football players wearing pink. We see, you can get something in pink for everything. And there are some really successful campaigns and some not so successful campaigns. But what we've seen is, over time, breast cancer went from something that was absolutely a death sentence to something where we have better imaging on the research side, the clinical side. We have better drugs. We can pinpoint cancers before they're cancers. It used to be stage 1, 2, 3, and 4, and now it's stage 0. Like, you're literally nowhere as of yet, and we can treat it. And that type of, the money came in, the drugs and drug developers came in. Now we're at a point where now, just like the AIDS crisis, it's shifted up, kind of a notch. And now we still see, we have something called triple negative breast cancer, meaning 3 of the biomarkers that we saw in tumors. If you have all negatives, predominantly that happens in women of color, that's a much more aggressive form of cancer. And now we're starting to say, okay, how can we drive dollars to that community, increase education, catching it earlier, making sure drugs are affordable? Because if we think about communities of color, a lot of times they don't have the healthcare, the healthcare wherewithal to catch things early. The emergency room may be their predominant way of interacting. So now we can start to shift those dollars and addressing now a subsegment of, a very large problem. And we are wildly successful. I will say, I'll use the word inundated, but not in a bad way. There's not a single person in the world that does not see a person wearing pink or that pink ribbon and not go, oh my God, okay, breast cancer. That quick triggering. That's what we should be doing as when we think about healthcare.
A couple of things that have come out of this discussion. Demonstration, experimentation, partnership, and then something that I want to talk a little bit about before we close, which is patience. So we talked about the quarter-to-quarter mindset. Patient capital, we think, kind of coming from the philanthropy world. And I'm going to have this come back around to Dr. Shante, but can you talk about the power of patience and the power of patient capital and how you've seen that make an impact? And then I'm going to give Dr. Shante the question first so she can think on it because it's a hard one. How do we instill the virtue of patience in venture capital? So, Jesse?
Well, thanks, Kasem. There's so many, I think, good examples. of patient capital. I mean, one here in the U.S. that I think that does resonate and has had many twists and turns. I mean, I think the Ford Foundation and the MacArthur Foundation, were one of the first innovators of program-related investments, PRIs, which are sort of the original form of patient capital in the U.S. I mean, and the organization I used to be, I cut my teeth with, so to speak, the Shore Bank Corporation, which was, I think one of the first, if not the first, regulated commercial banks that was explicitly created to combat redlining, which was a practice of, drawing a line on the map of the south side of Chicago and saying no bank will make a loan in these African-American neighborhoods. And the Ford Foundation and MacArthur Foundation, got behind, the four, rather idealistic, insanely courageous founders who bought a failing, bank in the South Side and, said, no, people put deposits in banks and they should be able to get a loan from that same bank in their neighborhood. Basic principle, very fundamental principle. It seems like a no-brainer in some ways to us now, but it certainly, I guess that's still open to debate, but we seem to have 2 steps forward and 1 step back, or the other way around sometimes. But, that was an early, highly risky venture, and Ford and MacArthur came in and got behind them in the early 80s, and the demonstration of the Shore Bank Corporation spawned the CDFI legislation passed under the Clinton administration in the 90s, which has generated a massive network effect. Right? Unfortunately, the Shore Bank itself is not with us as such, because of the financial crisis, but thousands and thousands of other institutions are, and Ford and MacArthur were along for that, throughout for decades as core investors in that enterprise, and that was transformative. And if they had taken a short-term approach, I think we would never have seen those outcomes. Because I often, when I talk as an investor, or I raise capital from investors, or work with institutions, I say incentives drive behaviors, drive outcomes. So if you do not align your incentives properly, you're going to drive the wrong behaviors and you're going to have the wrong outcomes. So you just have to be very clear. Right? So if you want long-term change, the capital driver has to be aligned to that. So I think that's probably one of the best examples that I know personally in the U.S. But there are a number. The Aga Khan Development Network, where I had the privilege of being affiliated, it's the world's largest private development network. Active in 30 countries, 100,000 employees. They make billions of dollars worth of investment. In their strategic planning process, when they go into a country, typically is built around 25 to 50-year plans, right? And that's how they invest capital. And they invest a mix of philanthropic and commercial capital when they go in, whether it's hospitals, banks, hydropower plants, hotels, whatever. But they look at it in a kind of a coherent framework. How does this enterprise get us to this ultimate objective of improving quality of life in the case of the Acadian? And how do we think about it over the long term? We might not make money in year 1, 2, or 3 for a commercial venture. But the point is, over time, as the community rises and quality of life improves and jobs are made available and the community prospers, we will see our business venture prosper. And that's another very concrete, real example of patient capital. But it does take a certain type of investor. That's why I think partnerships are critical, because we can't expect every investor to have that capability or that appetite. But what we can think about is, how do we combine investors in the right ways? Some investors are willing to take more risk. Some are willing to take less risk. Let's find a way to structure, our deals in such a way that we can align those risk appetites in a constructive way, and you get those patient capital outcomes.
Yeah. And that's a good segue in the question I asked you. And I actually didn't know that the Pink campaign started in 1984. That was news to me. To talk about patience, it was like getting that in the public awareness took quite some time. But in the world in which you live with venture capital, where the appetite is quarter to quarter, how do you, as part of that education to your bosses, the LPs, how do you instill the value or the virtue of patience?
Couple of ways. One, set expectations. When you have people putting capital into a fund, one of the things that I start out by saying is, one, you're not going to get your return. We're not exiting out of this for 3 years or 5 years or 7 years or 10 years. And I think a lot of people, even starting off, don't even know that that's what we're talking about. We always hear, big exits. Oh, the first backers of Facebook, oh my gosh, they made $1 billion or whatever they made. But no one actually did the math. The very first backers waited. They waited until it got to a maturity point. And so I think, and I'm not going to use the word sophisticated investor. I'm going to say savvy investors know that money grows over time, just like in the stock market. Like, I love the story that the guy who created the Dow Jones ticker literally said the worst thing in the world to do is actually watch your stock every single day. It drives you nuts. It gives you anxiety. You're going to jump out of a window because you're watching the natural human behavior goes up and down, right? And I think he was asked at one time, how often do you check? He's like, I don't know, once every 3 or 4 months, some really, like, he created a thing where I can do it in real time. Now we can, at least, and that's not even the real behavior. And so setting expectations and really saying, and in healthcare, we're talking about 5 to 7, 9 years down the line that you're going to see something. So setting those expectations for the money coming in. And I think the second thing that's really crucial, especially now that I feel like we're entering into a new breed of venture capital, is stop treating startups like publicly traded companies. There's a reason you're in the private market. You should have the flexibility to write your own rules. Stop waiting, treating them on this quarter to quarter. Now it's month over month. I saw somebody say ask for week over week revenue or something like that. It's like, why are we, I want to see trends, but I can tell you 2 data points is not a trend. So we have to stop treating them as if they're this long-term established company that's publicly traded, that's going to be on the 10Q, reporting cycle. Really saying, okay, this is where you are, right-sizing the opportunity. So not only do the partners in the fund know that we aren't going to extract any capital out of this company for 5 years. Give them the 5 years, literally. I always think, people get so antsy, oh, it's been a year and I'm not seeing any trending up. Okay, what if it literally takes 4 years and 11 months?
So there's a concept in psychology called locus of control. And the idea is that people who have an external locus of control tend to feel like life is happening to them. People with an internal locus of control feel like they have the ability to make decisions that will change the trajectory of their life. And so I want to close with the idea that we are where we are because of the choices that we've made. The choices our ancestors have made, the choices our politicians have made, a lot of ways, the choices that we've made in what we invest in, what we value. And we have an internal locus of control. Everyone watching this today is either a backer or a builder, they're an entrepreneur, they're an investor, they work with nonprofits, they're in the problems that we're talking about today, and they have control if they make the right choices. And so if you take anything away from this discussion, everyone watching today, I hope you take away that you can begin to make different choices today. If you're an investor, you can begin to make different choices. You can be more patient. You can seek out partnership. You can invest in the demonstration effect. You can experiment. You can talk with folks like Dr. Shante, who can show you the financial return. You can work with people like Jesse Fripp, who can show you examples throughout the world, things that have worked on a small scale that we can then pick up and put into the communities like Winston-Salem, where we need that kind of help. So you do have the choice to make a difference. It's about what do you want to invest your time in, your money in, and your effort in. And I thank everybody for joining us today. Thank you, Mr. Fripp.
Thank you, Kasem.
Thank you, Dr. Shante. Really appreciate you joining us.